Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today one of the most non-photogenic reviews that I've ever done. This all began with the set of cables you see here, which are the stock B&C cables provided with the Chord Hugo M-Scaler. These come packaged with the M-Scaler, and being a high-end endgame device, you would assume they're going to be pretty good for the job. After completing the M-Scaler review, I was contacted by Nick from Wave High Fidelity Cables, who offered to send me his dual B&C cables for use with the TT2 and the M-Scaler, in addition to a standard coaxial cable that you can use with any product at all. What particularly took my interest was the fact that these are the cables that Rob Watts himself has claimed to use with his M-Scaler and TT2 combo. So I was particularly interested and very thankful to Nick for sending these over and allowing me to do the review. Before we kick off, I should let you know a very important piece of information. The premium cables from Wave High Fidelity will set you back just shy of $2,000 US. I'm not kidding, that's not an error, that's not a verbal typo, whatever you want to call it. They are actually $2,000 B&C cables. Some of you will probably immediately have just reached over and switched off this video. That's totally fine. For those that are curious about why you might spend that much money, stick around and I'll tell you more. I should also add that the single cable of course doesn't cost that much, but it is still very expensive. So stick around and I'll try to explain why they cost as much as they do and whether or not it's worth the investment. Let me start off by going through the three cables that I'm talking about today. One of them I don't have here because it's still currently connected to the TT2 behind me, but that's the Storm reference level B&C cables. Those are the ones that will set you back about $1,900 US. That's a conversion from the list price of £1,410. For those viewers in Australia, this all equates to about 2,500 Australian dollars. So they're a serious investment, but again, if you've spent the sort of money you will have on a TT2 and an M-Scaler, you probably are interested in getting the most out of it. If you can hear some beeping in the background, I apologise. It's Bob the builder next door, not his real name of course, who's very busy today and doing lots of things. So as per some of my other reviews, I apologise for any building noises that creep in. I'll try to avoid them where possible. Moving on through the cables, stepping down a level, we've got what's called the Stream B&C cables. Again, these are a dual B&C cable for the TT2 M-Scaler combo, and these were designed to be a little bit more affordable, but they're still £895, which equates to about $1,200 US or about 1,600 Australian dollars. So it's still a significant investment, but it's still nearly half of what you're spending on the top of the range Storm cables. Of course, I'll talk shortly about whether or not it's worth spending the extra, what the differences are, and so on and so forth. The final piece of the puzzle here is the Storm B&C or SPITF cable. You can actually get it with any combination of B&C and SPITF connectors, and that cable retails for £795, which is 1,060 US or 1,440 Australian dollars, give or take depending on exchange rates. So all three of these cables are a really serious investment, and they're not something I'd recommend in any way, shape or form for somebody with a budget system. There are going to be much bigger upgrades you can get by spending more money elsewhere, whether it's on a DAC, an amp or a headphone improvement. As I've said in a number of my reviews, cables are something you add as the last pieces of the puzzle when you're looking for those final, 1, 2, 3% improvements. Based on what I've heard from the Wave High Fidelity cables, maybe that stretches to 5% improvement, but either way, it's still a small piece of the puzzle compared to those major components I just mentioned. So go into this review thinking about these as something to add to a high-end system when you've got everything else in place and you're looking to squeeze the last little bit of performance out of it. That's where these fit in. So with all that said, let me tell you a bit about the cables. If we use the stock cables that came with the M-Scaler as a reference point, you can see here they're very basic. They've got simple B&C connectors on the end and a simple sort of sheathing. There's no doubt shielding inside there as well, but there's nothing special going on. If I put these aside, what you're getting with the Wave High Fidelity cables is much more significant. We'll start with the Storm reference. Now this is the single Storm reference cable, but it's essentially the same as the dual version. And so I'm going to use this because it's easier to handle, and also it saves me unplugging the dual B&Cs from my TT2. What you're getting here is a solid silver core wire as your main conductor, and that's then got a foil and a mesh sheathing around it. So there's a high quality internal cable, but then the key to all of the Wave High Fidelity cables are these lumps you see here. Each of these is an iron ferrite, and the spacing between them has been very carefully determined by Nick over at Wave High Fidelity to ensure that it's filtering out any RF noise. You see, what's going on with these cables is ultimately, when they're not set up like this, they're picking up noise as an antenna essentially. And so they're feeding noise into your digital circuitry and therefore reducing your sound quality. One thing you may notice is that the connectors on these are very high quality. Either it's the OID cable connectors here, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, or it is the high quality, I'm not sure what brand they are, but high quality, very sturdy looking BNC connectors on the Stream cable. You can choose which connectors to get in the case of the Storm. I think with the Stream it's fixed and it's just those that I've shown you there and that you'll see in the Glamour video. So the way these cables are set up is really important and it's really what you're paying for. There's been a lot of time and effort gone into making sure that these cables are incredibly well shielded, both through the foil and the mesh, but also that the ferrites, the iron rings, are correctly spaced all the way down the cable to filter out any environmental noise. One thing that's really important about ferrites is for them to work effectively, they need to be snug to the cable, but if they're too tight and they start to pinch the cable, they're going to reduce the effectiveness of the insulation, any shielding, and potentially the conductor itself. So in the case of the wave cables here, they're firmly in place, they spin a little bit, but you can feel they're snug around the insulation of the cable underneath. One thing I do want to point out, and this is going to put off some people, it kind of puts me off a little bit, but not enough to get in the way once you hear the sound quality. So the thing that I'm talking about here is that in between each of these ferrites is a spacer. In the case of the Storm cables, these spacers are made up of O-rings. So these are just standard home hardware style O-rings that you could buy from your local hardware store. That's not so bad. I think they actually look quite good, and obviously something is needed to correctly space out these ferrites. In the case of the Stream cable though, I'm not quite as impressed with the choice of material. What's being used here is a piece of basically garden hose. It's a clear reinforced hose with an O-ring at each end. Now ultimately all that really matters is that it's spacing out the ferrites properly, but it is so obviously a piece of hose that to me it did devalue the product a little bit when I realized what it was. Once again, what should really matter is how it sounds, but I did want to point that out because if you've just spent $1,000 or more than $1,000 depending on the currency you're working in on a set of cables and you look at it and see that it's got garden hose in it, you may think twice about the quality you're getting. So I want to say two things here. Firstly, I do think there could have been a better choice of spacer material, but secondly, don't let it put you off. These cables are still amazing. Before I go on to talk about the sound quality they provide, I want to touch on a couple more things. One of them is the weight. These things weigh a ton. Because each of these lumps is a piece of iron, you can imagine the weight in the cable. On top of that, they're using high quality solid core conductors. So there is a huge amount of materials cost and weight in these cables. The other thing to mention is the Storm cable, which is the pinnacle of the brand, came first, and it's your no holds barred cable. Whether it's the dual version or the single version, it's that solid, high purity silver conductor. When you step down to the Stream cables, what you're getting is a solid core copper conductor with slightly lower quality connectors, but they are still excellent. According to the Wave website, the Stream was made specifically to provide most of the benefits of the Storm, but at a more reasonable price point. As you'll hear in a second, they are both fantastic, but there's definitely a reason to go for the Storm if you're in a position to do so. One of the things I haven't mentioned yet is that when you buy these cables, worldwide shipping is included. So based on the weight of the cables and also the packaging they come in, which is this beautiful, huge wooden box, and it needs to be huge, it's not huge for the sake of it, it has to be to fit these cables in because you don't want to coil them too much or you may actually break or damage the sheathing that's protecting the noise from getting into the cable itself. So it needs a big box, and because of the box and the weight, shipping is going to be expensive on these. So a little bit of the cost is going to be covering shipping, and that shipping is going to be expensive. I like the fact though that it's all included. You don't have to think about it, you just order it and you know exactly the price you're paying. There is also a more budget cable called the Stone cable. I haven't heard that one, I haven't reviewed it, so I'm not going to comment on its quality, but I believe it comes in a different packaging, so if you do order that, don't expect the wooden box that you're going to see in the Glamour video, but do know that you're going to be getting what I expect would be a well-made and well thought out cable despite the lower price point. talk now about sound. When I first hooked them up, I did it in a bit of a hurry. I had a really quick listen, and I was using the single coax cable at the time from my Raspberry Pi to, I think, the M scaler, but I'm not sure. But anyway, the key thing I wanted to tell you is my impressions were pretty ho-hum. I listened to it, and I honestly wasn't sure that I was hearing an improvement. So I have to say, I went into this review with expectations of minimal improvements. The reason I think that's important to share with you is that testing cables like this is really difficult. A lot of it has to be based on memory because I have to unplug the old cables and plug in the new cables and then use auditory memory to work out if there's really a difference. To help with that process, I did record some audio from the TT2 using the stock M-scaler cables and then the stream cables and then the storm cables and set them up for some A/B blind testing. So what you're about to hear me talk about is a combination of my blind testing to first and foremost work out if I was hearing a difference, and then my non-blind testing to really understand what those differences were. Let me reiterate before I go too much further, the differences at this sort of level of product are subtle. They're not changing your entire system, but there is no doubt from my blind testing, each time I could hear a difference between them and I could describe the difference that I was hearing. The nuances then came as I spent more time not doing the blind testing anymore because the process of recording actually reduces the sound quality slightly. So for the final nuances of my descriptions that you're about to hear, I was doing non-blind visible testing. So with all that in mind, let me tell you what I heard. I used the same track throughout for this, and it was Blue Alert by Madeline Peru. The first step in my testing was to go from the stock cables from the M-scaler over to the stream. So that's going from the absolute base provided by Chord and stepping up to the most affordable option I've been given here in the stream cables before I take another step up to the storm. The differences I heard in the blind testing, I would have described as just an overall smoother sound. Everything was just smoother and cleaner and more enjoyable. When I listened to it more in the non-blind testing, I was able to hear some more nuances and really take my time with the listening. And what I found was that the stream cables brought more detail forward in the mid-range. Not that they brought the mid-range forward, but they gave a better sense of the detail in the mid-range by taking away any of that RF noise that was masking and kind of putting a very, very slight haze over the sound. The high frequencies are a little bit smoother. They're not reduced, they're not rolled off, but overall they're a little bit smoother. And to put that into context, using something like the HD800S, which for me is constantly on the edge of comfort in the treble, that didn't change. So it wasn't like it's changing the tonal balance of the music at all. What it's doing is it's removing a layer of noise that's subtle enough that you don't necessarily notice it when it's there, but you definitely notice it when it's gone. Ultimately, what I found was with the stream, everything just became more realistic and easier to listen to. And I found that even with something like the HD800S, that is an amazing headphone, but is not my preferred listening experience, I found it much easier to listen to and to actually enjoy something like the HD800S because the sound was so much more pure, and an analytical tool like the HD800S was no longer showing me the harshness that came from the RF noise picked up by the stock cables. Moving on then from the stream to the storm, the difference was less dramatic. So it's an incremental step going from the stream up to the more expensive storm cable compared to the significant jump, I would say, from the stock cables to the stream. So obviously what that means is if the stock cables are 5 out of 10, and I'm just using arbitrary numbers here, if the stock cables are 5 out of 10, the stream maybe takes you to an 8 out of 10, so it's a fairly significant jump, whereas the storm only takes you up to the 10 out of 10. So it's a difference of, say, 3 steps in my random arbitrary scale to go from stock to stream, and 2 steps to go from stream to storm. So yes, it's an improvement, but it's not as big an improvement as you go from the stock to the stream. The differences, once again, were basically the same, but just another step better. So again, the music was smoother, more detailed, more realistically presented, better sense of space because you haven't got any of that noise getting in the way. So everything was just a little bit better again, exactly as I described it, going from the stock to the stream. One of the tracks I also listened to here was Sooner or Later by Supertramp. In that track, the stream had a bit more harshness to it in the snare hits, whereas with the Storm, the more expensive cable, the snare hits were still had all the energy and detail, but were just a bit smoother to listen to. And by smoother, I probably mean more refined. So again, it wasn't rolling it off or changing tonality, it was just presenting it more cleanly and therefore more enjoyable to the ears. One thing that really stood out to me in this testing was that the upgrade in these cables, both from stock to stream and then from stream to storm, brought out so much quality in classical music. I think classical music lovers are probably the best place to really enjoy these cables because it just makes everything so rich and full and detailed, but again without changing the tonal character of the music. I have to admit that as much as I was open to the chances of small incremental improvements from these cables, I was completely blown away by just how much difference and just how much improvement to the sound they made. That's in the context once again of these being a final piece of the puzzle piece of equipment. So again, I'm not saying they're going to take a basic system and make it sound like a high-end system. What I'm saying is they're going to take a high-end system and make it sound maybe 5% better still. But that difference is significant and it is noticeable. Before I wrap things up, I do want to mention the standalone coax cable here. So this one is designed if you've got any system at all that uses a SPDIF connector and or BNC. You can have it with both BNC, both SPDIF, however you want it set up. That's available for those of you that don't use the Chord products but do want the benefits of a high quality BNC or SPDIF cable. For my testing, I set it up with the Raspberry Pi using the BNC output on the DigiPlus Pro board and connecting it up to the Schiit Bifrost 2 DAC. So we're not talking crazy high-end equipment here. The Raspberry Pi set up with the DigiPlus Pro board, probably a couple $100, I can't remember anymore, and the Bifrost 2 is less than $1,000. And yet what I heard was probably a more significant improvement using the single coax cable compared to what I heard with the TT2 and the M-Scaler. The differences were all of the same nature, so an improved sense of space, improved sense of clarity, smoothness, richness and detail. All of those things were still the improvements I heard, but the improvement going from a fairly decent coax cable up to the high-end Storm cable was absolutely huge. If the Storm and the Stream cables with the TT2 and the M-Scaler are maybe a 5% increase, I'd go as far as saying that I think the solo coax cable in the Raspberry Pi Schiit Bifrost 2 setup was probably more like a 10% increase. I'm not sure entirely what to put that down to. It could be the devices used in their own shortcomings. It could be something to do with the different connections I was using. Maybe the SPDIF connector on the Storm cable is a true 75 ohm, whereas the one on my generic cable is not. I'm not sure. All I know is it made a really significant improvement. Now, whether it's worth spending that sort of money to get that sort of improvement with a DAC that's worth less than that, that's a whole other question and one that I'll leave you to work out. But what I can tell you is that the Wave high fidelity cables are absolutely the real deal, and they are a brilliant improvement, again, to high-end equipment where you're looking for that last incremental gain. For my money, if I was going to make this investment, I would probably go all out and go straight for the Storm cable. The Stream cable is excellent, but I do think the Storm just takes it to another level and really performs well. On a side note, if you're somebody like me that generally doesn't lean towards silver cables, keep in mind that when you're talking about the transmission of digital information, which is what a coax cable is doing, the silver cable does seem to do a better job and does not change the tonal character in the way that silver can with analog signal cables. Now, if you've watched my USB cable review for the Curious Evolved cable, you'll know that these cables are carrying an analog signal that represents a digital waveform. And that's why noise is an issue and why an improved cable can make a difference despite it transmitting digital information. So just to say that again, they're transmitting digital information, but it is represented with an analog waveform, i.e. a varying voltage running down a wire. And that's why improved cables are important. If you're unsure about any of that, I'll post a link below so you can read up a little bit more on why digital cables can make a difference. For now though, I'll give you a chance to pick your jaws up off the floor, having heard what these cables cost. Some of you will no doubt have your wallets quivering in the corner. Others of you might be working out if you can sell a child, all those sorts of things going on. So I'll leave you to it for now. Enjoy your music, happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.